what other kinds of NGOs can we think of? And one of the things that we can imagine is about more human and perhaps food network issues. So we have some of these certification initiatives. This is not the only one. We will have one more example. But fair trade that we're talking here about is a kind of reconnection of consumers, or us, and the producers or the farmers. And it's a theme that you would very often come across if you are, for example, studying in Britain. So this is about the certification and the labeling, which we see here in this picture, that would come together with this assurance that products are really benefiting the farm workers at the end of the supply chain. So the point here is that we want to have an ethical standpoint and consider producers first. What often would happen is that various farmers would be exploited, and throughout the food chain, what we spend on food would be spent on the traders. And because these people can be vulnerable and marginalized and powerless, what fair trade is trying to do is to develop a cooperative where various groups sign up, or groups are formed, and as farmers sign up, they need to follow specific regulations. So here they would have a guaranteed minimum price to protect producers. This would make sure that they cannot be exploited. There are also various investments that are supported both environmentally and socially. And there's a reduction on this pressure on producers. So they have advance payments, they're paid money in advance as in the form of a cooperative. They are not forced to sell products following the market prices. So if the price of, for example, coffee or cocoa would drop, they would not need to lose all their investments because the minimum price would protect them. And there's also equal treatment of the complete supply chain, dealing more directly with the producers. So that's how fair trade, as the name would suggest, would mean that trading does not exploit farmers. But how does it work then? What kind of standards can we think of more in details? It's about, once again, minimum requirements that all producer organizations should meet. So they need to fit a specific standard. They are also about wages and child labor. So what kind of payments should not only the farmers, but the laborers, the workers, be paid? So these have to be fair as well. At the same time, child labor is going to be prohibited. So obviously, children should not be exploited. They should be at school. There are specific rules on use of pesticides, herbicides, and GMO products as well. And as well, we can think of, in the form of cooperatives here, democratic decision making between various farmers. So fair trade is basically about connection between people. So it's a social story, but we can consider it as an NGO definitely. Another similar organization is about more of a biodiversity focus. The Rainforest Alliance is again an international non-profit organization that is working at the intersection of business and agriculture, similarly to fair trade, but also focus on forestry in order to make responsible business the new norm. And so it's an alliance of companies, farmers, foresters, communities and consumers that are committed to creating a world where people and nature thrive in harmony. So again, this works with an eco-label, which means if you see these products in the shop, it will mean that these products have met specific standards and have been following various practices. So the aim is to conserve biodiversity here and ensure sustainable livelihoods by transforming land use practices, business practices, and consumer behavior. So if you're once again studying abroad, you will very often come across these labels. If you go shopping in a supermarket, you will see Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade certified products. And this might be strange for someone coming from China, where I think ethical issues are not going to be in the forefront. What you can do now is have a look at the 3 videos that are about these organizations, which I attached on QQ, 2 on Fair Trade and 1 on Rainforest Alliance, and think about how these differ from each other. At the same time, what we can have a look at is how this sustainable forestry certification works with Rainforest Alliance, because it's much more focused on the environment compared to fair trade, which is more about a social story. It's about people and markets. But what we see here is not only this market driven and environmentally and socially responsible management of forests, tree farms and forest resources, but also about the sustainable agriculture certification. So how, while products are produced, what kind of ecosystem conservation, biodiversity, wild animal issues, waterways and so on topics have to be taken into consideration. So what you can as well do, if you have a look at these 3 videos which give more explanation and a background story to how these NGOs work, can have a look at the standards. So basically the manual or the booklet of Rainforest Alliance on what kind of different topics shall be taken into consideration if someone wants to enter. And here there are going to be, of course, beyond these social issues, things like health, safety, also water management, energy, resources, natural habitat, indigenous species, and so on. So these all have to be covered in the plan, and before anyone would enter this kind of cooperative once again, in order to produce under the label of Rainforest Alliance, all these have to be met. So you can just have a look at and think about what the differences are between these 2 groupings, Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. Now, NGOs are also going to be related to activism, so perhaps not so much organized as the previous 2 topics. But here we can also think about NGOs and activism, where activism would be the use of direct and noticeable action to achieve a result, usually that is a political or social one, We can also define it as taking action to effect social change, or can think about acting voluntarily to support a personal belief. That's how we can just think about activism in general. And what we have here is like Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, for example, or how we can think about women's rights. And what we would often find in the Western world is people standing up for their own interests and supporting their personal views. And this might be going out to the street, protesting, or even blocking the streets in certain cases. What would mean that people physically want the government, the state, to realize how important certain issues are for the people. This is, I guess, different from what you see in China in many cases. In China, you won't go out to the street and march with tables or banners and so on. What we can have a look at is just cases here from the Western world, and I want to highlight the Greenpeace. Once again, here you have a video on how Greenpeace works, or what Greenpeace does. So the Greenpeace is going to be a very kind of hardcore NGO. Why I say that, it's often going to be working against government actions or government interests. It does have offices in various countries, but Greenpeace is often going to be something that you do not link with office work. It's often going to be with various shocking activities of people doing strange things. Perhaps climbing on various installations, distracting industrial activities, and so on. So the goal here is to ensure the ability of the earth to nurture life in all its diversity. So this is how they would define themselves. And so Greenpeace would be about campaigning. So it's activism here. It is the base of their existence. It's about campaigning on worldwide issues such as climate change, deforestation, overfishing, whaling, energy, anti-nuclear issues. So nowadays, we'd say it's mostly about issues of that we would consider strictly as environmental. But originally it was about nuclear testing, so that's why peace is part of the name. And here we see this unique logo of Greenpeace. So they were originally about opposing the Cold War activities of the United States and Canada, if we think of where it was originated, and things like the Vietnamese War that so many people were against in the States. So they were against these military actions. But later, they were focusing their shift on whaling. So how to protect whales by occupying ships, for example. And this is how their activity, their drastic approaches or shocking approaches have developed. And nowadays, there are various different issues that are, for example, against GMO products. So usually it's about creative confrontation, campaigning and confrontation, in order to expose global environmental problems that they want to have. They'd say that they'd like to stop the planet from warming beyond 1.5 degrees to prevent this catastrophic impacts of climate change. at the same time protect biodiversity and slow the volume of hyperconsumption, to learn to live within our means, and to promote renewable energy and oppose oil production very often, and so to nurture peace and global disarmament and non-violence, to follow the original aim of Greenpeace. So how do these creative, as we said, confrontation going to look like? They have some of these ships they own where they can, for example, destruct whaling, so industrial scale fishing as well. There would also be some of these banners that they hang out in football games as well, in surprising ways often, to present their ideas in order to make people aware and catch the message about these various issues. So you can once again find a video on Greenpeace as well. What I would think about, we should also have a look at, is specific climate activists, because this is going to be an issue that it has emerged in only the past few years. So then here we should learn about one person, who's Greta Thunberg. Maybe you have or haven't heard about her. She's a Swedish girl who's 18 years old now, and she's basically a climate change activist. And she rose to prominence for inspiring widespread student-led protests around the globe. If you ever study in Europe or the United States, probably you will come across her name, because she's so famous nowadays. The thing about her is that she's a very young and weak girl who was able to catch the public's interest as she started protesting in front of the Swedish parliament, and later on started skipping for school in order, again, to protest against the government, the Swedish government's actions. So now she says that big governments and businesses around the world are slow to cut carbon emissions, and has attacked world leaders as well for failing young people. What this means, that because this girl is so famous, she has been, for example, invited to a United Nations meeting in New York. Of course, she didn't fly because flying has such a big environmental footprint, so she sailed over on a boat from Europe to America. Anyhow, she had this very famous speech that she directed to some of these leaders of various countries who gathered in New York. So it was, again, an interesting sight how a very young and weak girl is talking to leaders of powerful countries, saying, "How dare you?" So this was the language she was using. Again, why I want to talk about these, because this kind of activism is something that you would often not find in China, and this is a language that you would not use in China in many ways. If you're talking to a political leader or someone who's older than you, you would not try to use this language and say, "How dare you?" But the case here is that it's especially the old, perhaps 60, 50, 70, and so on year old political leaders who are making decisions now. But especially it's the teenagers, such as this girl, who will in the future suffer from decisions made by politicians. So the point here is that the youth have to stand out for their rights of having a better future that current politicians would not provide to them. And finally, I just want to highlight what else can go on. The Extinction Rebellion is going to be an even more drastic or shocking, perhaps, grouping that would go for non-violent civil or disobedience activist movement. And what this would mean, that these people would, for example, break into airports and stop the airplanes in London from departing, as they want to highlight how they believe climate and ecological emergency exists, and so to force governments to take immediate action and to address climate change. So this Extinction Rebellion was launched in 2018, and organizers say it now has groups willing to take action in dozens of countries already. And once again, for example, in London, the Extinction Rebellion has been famous from blocking the streets, people sitting down in the middle of the roads and blocking traffic in order to send over their message, not only to the public, but also to the government. So you can also find a little video on how this kind of grouping works, what they have done and who they are. So please have a look at all these videos, because these are, I guess, you might say, not serious, and these are not part of management from a technological or scientific point of view. But these are exactly the approaches that are different, or approaches of thinking about the environment and what can or should and how should be done between the West and China. Okay, so today we said that there should be a couple of interests, of course, residing in various groups, but we need to identify them. And often interests are going to be articulated in different ways. Perhaps they're going to be difficult to identify in the case of marginalized groups. Other groups, of course, will be very loud. But we need to take into consideration what these are and what the messages are, and in all that they exist. So what we will see is that some of them are formalized, such as Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance, where people sign up to follow various regulations. There will also be some of these informal groups or activists, perhaps even individual activists. And there can be some of these various connections between potential stakeholders that can itself have an impact on the environment. So how activists make the public behave in different ways, or how the Fair Trade or the Rainforest Alliance itself, before even environmental manager would think about what should be done, these NGOs take care of some of the environmental issues. So this is just to give an insight to some of these approaches to environmental management or social groupings that exist in the Western world. So thanks for your attention, and see you tomorrow.